so many of you and from different places. And I think also the variety of people who've joined us shows the breadth of David Feldman's scholarship. But David Feldman is as much a renowned historian of Britain as he is an historian of the experience of migration and minorities. And of course, he's an historian of the Jewish experience in Britain. And he's also contributing now very importantly and very bravely, dare I say, to contemporary debates. He recently edited a volume on the effects of bans and sanctions in history and since the 18th century, was it, David?
Since the American Revolution.
Since the American Revolution, okay, that's right, and until now. And you can see that historical breadth is really characteristic of his interests. I've known him for several decades, and his first book already set the tone, Englishmen and Jews, which was an exploration both of social relations and where Jews really fitted into the politics of Britain between 1840 and 1914. And he's edited several important collections in all those different areas that I've just mentioned. And he's the go-to person for any one of us who wants our work to be read carefully and critiqued trenchantly, but also commented on ultimately with generosity of spirit and humanity. So David is also a great helper and what we call a mensch. So that is how and why we're so delighted to have him with us. His title is sort of extraordinary, really. It's Bigots, Semites, and Anti-Semites. And we'd expect no less from the director of the Pears Center for the Study of Antisemitism, which is whose home is Birkbeck, where David is professor. So, David, please, I'm just delighted to ask you to come out of your gloom there in your sitting room and speak to us. And you'll speak for about half an hour or so, and then we'll have questions in the usual manner. And although we speak so often and we discuss, and I've read all your stuff, I must say I'm really excited about hearing you speak now. So the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Miri. That was an extremely lovely and generous introduction, and I just hope I can live up to it. So, for the last 5 years in the UK, anti-Semitism has never been far from the political headlines. And the same goes for many other countries in the world. One part of this controversy has turned on an argument over what is and what is not anti-Semitic. One striking feature of debate over Labour Party anti-Semitism, for example, is that everyone involved denies they are anti-Semitic. Evidently, people, both Jews and non-Jews, hold different ideas about what anti-Semitism is. I don't see my task as a historian to adjudicate in these debates, or at least not to do so in a direct way. Instead, as a historian, I can ask how these bitter disagreements have arisen. And this has led me to embark on a research project which asks how our ideas about anti-Semitism have developed over time. In other words, what did people mean by anti-Semitism in the past? This question, I think, opens a new window on the past, and it may provide a fresh perspective on the present. So in a sense, my subject this evening is anti-Semitism. However, my primary focus is not on prejudice against Jews, on negative stereotypes, insult, discrimination, and violence, but instead, I want to focus on the words and ideas that Jews and non-Jews have used to describe and explain all those things. Today, we use the word anti-Semitism to refer to all antipathy, violence, and discrimination directed at Jews, and we tend to regard anti-Semitism as an age-old hatred, the longest hatred in the words of the late Robert Wistrich. The word encompasses a wide range of phenomena from physical assault to insult to conspiracy theory. Yet for most of the 19th century, none of this would have made sense to people in Britain, or anywhere else in the world for that matter. In part, this is because the term anti-Semite barely existed in English or any other language, and the term only became a commonplace after 1880, following the creation of the Anti-Semitic League in Germany the previous year. So I'm not going to begin with the term anti-Semitism itself, although I will end up with the term, but with how Jews and non-Jews in early Victorian Britain conceived of those things which their children and grandchildren would come to label anti-Semitic. So how did people talk about anti-Semitism before the term existed? I'll begin in 1840. This was the year of the Damascus blood libel, a set of events that today few would hesitate to describe as anti-Semitic. On the 5th of February 1840, 2 men disappeared from the streets of Damascus. One was a Capuchin monk, Padre Tommaso, the second his servant, Ibrahim Amara. The Ottoman Governor General of Syria, egged on by the French consul, arrested, tortured, and interrogated 3 Jews. One died, but 2 others were induced to confess that the missing men had been murdered and their blood had been used to make what was called Passover dough. Further arrests, tortures, and confessions followed. That spring and early summer, there were a series of meetings in London and in the English provinces to protest against the treatment of Jews in Damascus. In July, Moses Montefiore, together with the French Jewish leader Adolphe Crémieux, set off for Damascus with the aim of exonerating and freeing the Jewish population. What is important for my concern this evening is how British Jews conceived this protest and Montefiore's mission. What is striking from the language employed is that it did not foreground prejudice against Jews as the fundamental issue, and further, it was not rooted in an understanding of prejudice against Jews as something which is endemic in the world. On the contrary, the events enacted in Damascus were presented as an example of something that the civilized world has surpassed. Speaking at a public meeting held at the Great Synagogue in Duke's Place, the banker David Solomons, a pioneer of Reformed Judaism and later a member of Parliament, spoke and placed the ritual murder accusation in Damascus in a narrative which congratulated British society on its civilized modernity. The gross calumnies concerning the Jews, Solomons said, afford a striking contrast between the present age and the dark periods of history. Most others, too, placed the news from Damascus in a universalist and liberal framework, not a specifically Jewish one. In Parliament, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, stated it was an instance of barbarity and atrocity which one could not have expected to hear of in these days in any country having communication or intercourse with the civilized world. The dreadful accusations against the Jews were seen as significant, but the lesson they taught did not concern the longevity or even the specific character of the persecution of Jews. Instead, they highlighted the distinction between barbarity and civilization. We find something very similar if we look at the political argument over whether or not Jews should enjoy equal rights in Britain at this time. The debate reached its highest pitch in 1847 and 48 after the election of Lionel de Rothschild as one of the members of Parliament for the City of London. The question now was whether he should be allowed to take his seat in the House of Commons. The requirement that he swear one of the oaths on the true faith of a Christian was a barrier to Rothschild and to any professing Jew. Here too, the opponents of Jewish rights were censured in universalist terms. In December 1847, when the Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, introduced his bill to remove Jewish disabilities, he urged the measure, quote, as a matter of right, and he appealed to universal amity. He said, there is no part of the human race, however divided from us by feeling or by color, which does not yet belong to the family of man. Justice to the Jews was enlisted by Russell alongside the emancipation of the slaves as a true expression of Christian universalism. And Russell also emphasized the essential similarity of peoples, despite superficial differences of religion and color. This view of emancipation was echoed by many others. Reason and progress were the corollaries of universalism. The emancipation of the Jews is but a natural step in the progress of civilization, William Hazlitt pronounced. Jewish advocates echoed this same universalist discourse. Henry Fodell, a businessman with interest in shipping in Southampton, a communal activist and a Freemason, took the same route, tracing the progress of enlightenment and civilization in the 100 years since the Jew Bill of 1753. It followed from this that the opponents of reform were characterized as antagonists of reason and enlightenment in general, and not of the Jews specifically. Neither truly Christian nor reasonable, they were derided in the press as irrational, prejudiced, and as fools, but not as anti-Jewish in the first instance. The Manchester Times and Gazette declared, "We have advanced too far on the road to religious equality to make it an object for even the bigot to stop short." Opponents of reform knew only too well how they would be painted. Every Whig or radical seemed to think every conservative a bigot, observed sadly the Tory peer Lord Stanley when Lord Rothschild tried to take his seat in Parliament. By the 1880s, things had changed, as we shall see. The self-proclaimed universalism of the second quarter of the 19th century increasingly was challenged. First, Jews found that the universalist conception of bigotry and exclusion was becoming less effective as a tool against persecution. Second, the universalism of the earlier part of the century was challenged by new theories and new ideas which emphasized the differences, not the similarities between peoples. And I'll discuss each of these in turn. So first of all, the effectiveness of universalism, the growing ineffectiveness of universalism. In 1858, in August 1858, news reached London that in Bologna, a detachment of Carabinieri had seized Edgardo Mortara, a 6-year-old Jewish boy. Satisfied that Edgardo had been baptized secretly some years earlier by a Catholic housemaid employed by the family, the city's inquisitor claimed the boy for the church to raise him a Catholic. The abduction of little Edgardo became a European scandal. In London, the Board of Deputies sent Moses Montefiore to travel to Rome in hope of an audience with Pope Pius IX. In his letter to Jewish communities in France and Holland to gain support for his mission, Montefiore emphasized the universal dimension of events in Bologna. They did not affect Jews alone, but every other faith, he said, placing in peril personal liberty, social relations, and the peace of families. But unlike the case of the Damascus blood libel, on this occasion, universalism proved a blunt instrument. Montefiore's mission was completely unsuccessful. When he arrived in Rome, armed with a memorial and hoping for an interview with the Pope, the Times correspondent declared his mission to be a hopeless case, and so it proved. A decade later, the failure of the great powers, including Britain, to ensure equality for Jews in the principalities of Moldova and Wallachia, what would later become Romania, provided contemporaries with a vivid illustration of really what had happened earlier in Bologna. In the principalities, in the 1866 Constitution, the Constitution was altered in 1866 to prevent foreign Jews from becoming citizens, and the government went on to impose discriminatory legislation against Jews. In particular, the prohibition on Jews residing outside towns led to violence and hundreds of expulsions in 1867, violence and expulsions which recurred periodically over the next decade. The treatment of Jews in Romania was made widely known by the press, and it became the occasion for intercession by Jewish leaders. The government in Bucharest and the populace there were denounced in universalist terms. The Jewish Chronicle derided the mass of the Romanian population as the rudest, most ignorant, and most bigoted in Europe. The high point of protest came in 1872 with a meeting at the Mansion House in London. The Earl of Shaftesbury, the Christian evangelical veteran of the Damascus campaign, moved the first resolution, which called on the meeting to protest against the outrages committed on the Jews in Romania as a disgrace to modern civilization. Montefiore traveled to Bucharest in 1867 to try to ameliorate conditions there for the Jews, but on this occasion as well, his mission ended in failure. The Liberal Foreign Secretary, Earl Granville, remained silent. His reluctance to intervene was supported by his decades-long experience, which showed the ineffectiveness of British power in the principalities. And Anglo-Jewish action, as the case of Romania showed, was only as effective as British diplomacy. Jews had used the language of universalism to good effect in the 1840s and 1850s to promote claims to equality at home and protection overseas. Jews and liberals ascribed their success to the march of civilization and progress and the growing distance of the age from the medieval past. But their victories were more contingent than this, more contingent than they admitted or realized. In the Damascus affair, universalism, allied to British diplomacy and force of arms, carried the day against the upstart Viceroy Muhammad Ali. It won concessions for Jews from the Ottoman Empire, which was increasingly dependent on British support for its integrity in Europe and the Near East. The Mutara case, by contrast, brought Jews and their allies into conflict with a venerable European power, the papacy, whose autonomy and prestige compensated for what it lacked in arms. The Pope refused even to see Montefiore. In Romania too, British influence was ineffective in the face of a European principality which enjoyed the protection of another great power, Russia. The Mutara affair and the treatment of Jews in Romania were chastening episodes. At the same time as the political impact of universalism was receding, there was the rise of a set of ideas which served to undermine the intellectual appeal and kudos of universalism. In understanding this, we need to reckon with the influence of one man above all others, Friedrich Max Müller. It was Müller who, more than anyone else, popularized in the 1860s and 1870s the concepts of the Aryan and the Semite in Britain and indeed in the world, and the supposedly profound differences between the Aryan and the Semite. Born in Germany and a comparative philologist, Müller spent most of his adult life at Oxford. He was a Victorian superstar, a sort of equivalent of Simon Schama and Mary Beard rolled into one and magnified tenfold. He was the leading public intellectual of these decades. Müller developed and popularized the idea that there were three distinct language families: Turanian, Aryan, and Semitic. And this became a template which he and others used to develop accounts of the deeply ingrained influence of culture, of cultural and racial differences in human history. In this way, Muller was a pivotal figure in the history of thinking about race when that field was dominated by philology, not biology. Muller believed that Aryan and Semitic religions were formed quite differently on account of the linguistic structures which shaped Aryan and Semitic language families. Aryans, he proposed, conceived their deities wielding the powers of nature. Their religions in India and ancient Greece were characterized by mythology. Semitic gods, by contrast, dealt with the destinies of individuals, races, and nations. And this could be seen clearly in the case of the Jews, he argued, and I quote here, "They, the Jews, worshipped a single God, and whenever they fell into idolatry, they felt they had fallen away from God. But that God, under whatever name they invoked him, was especially their God, their own national God. And this existence did not preclude the existence of other gods or demons." Judaism was not a real monotheism, Muller argued, and Jehovah was first and foremost a tribal god. Christianity had begun as a mere reform of the ancient Jewish religion. It was only once it had transferred from Semitic to Aryan ground, he said, that it could develop its real nature and importance as the religion of humanity. The consequences of the linguistic separation of humankind into these three language families continue to be felt over millennia, Muller argued. He presented a narrative in which the ancestors of the Celts, the Germans, who then became the Anglo-Saxons, the Slavonians, the Greeks and Italians, the Persians and Hindus had all lived together beneath the same roof in Asia, separate from the ancestors of the Semitic and Turanian race. Those Aryan nations which had migrated in a northwesterly direction were now the principal nations of northwestern Asia and Europe. He wrote, "These Aryan nations have become rulers of history, and it seems to be their mission to link all parts of the world together by the chains of civilization, commerce, and religion. In a word, they represent the Aryan man in his historical character." Increasingly, Muller's philology, in conjunction with others such as the French Orientalist Ernest Renan, shaped thinking about Jews and their differences from non-Jews, especially amongst progressive liberal intellectuals. So let me recap. We began with Jews and non-Jews successfully combating the persecution and exclusion that Jews experienced, and doing so, presenting their actions in terms of universal values and not as a pursuit of a specifically Jewish cause. We then found two challenges to this way of addressing the Jews' problems and opponents. First, it became less successful when faced with European states who discriminated against Jews. And secondly, it was challenged by new and prestigious currents in intellectual life, which either qualified or discarded universalism by drawing attention to what its proponents saw as deep-seated and hugely consequential differences between human cultures, between Aryans and Semites. And although Jews were not the only Semites, they were the only Semites living in Europe in large numbers. Increasingly, they looked like matter out of place. In this final section of my talk, I want to turn to the Jewish response to these challenges and the changes that this brought, because these responses provide the context in which the term anti-Semite came to Britain in 1870 and how we can understand what the term meant then. First, the failure of the Board of Deputies of Montefiore and the British government to intercede effectively on behalf of Romanian Jews led to the creation in 1871 of an organization, the Anglo-Jewish Association. It was the brainchild of the Jewish financier and MP Isaac Lyon Goldsmith and Abraham Benish, the veteran editor of the Jewish Chronicle. The AJA was to be the vehicle for international philanthropy and lobbying on behalf of Jews globally. It did not aim to abandon universalism as the basis for advancing Jewish interests, but the organization did aim to supplement it with a new imperative of and explicit imperative of Jewish solidarity. This was expressed eloquently by Sergeant Simon, a barrister and Liberal MP for Dewsbury and one of the founders of the AJA. The association was to be, he said, a new bond of brotherhood among the scattered fragments of our race. And this is a new invocation of race in the British context in the early 1870s. The AJA promoted what it conceived to be universal goals, but it did so while articulating a new emphasis on the particularity and solidarity of Jewry. At the same time, in the wake of the failures in Bologna and Romania, some British Jews searched for new words to better convey the particularity of the persecution and exclusion suffered by Jews. This search for new terms preceded the arrival of the term anti-Semite. So in the mid and late 1870s, we find three new arresting terms in circulation. Judeophobia as a word arrives on the scene before it quickly disappears, but it's there for a few years before it's superseded by anti-Semite. So Judeophobia arrives with its modern medical and pathological connotations. We also find British Jews reaching for an older German term, Judenhetze, and inserting it in English sentences. And finally, George Eliot in Theophrastus Such, her final book, published in 1879, just a year before her death, entitled one of her chapters, The Latest Hep, Hep, Hep. The title chapter evoked the notorious outbreaks of plunder and violence against Jews in Germany in 1819. However, Eliot's main point of reference was the outbreak of rhetorical attacks on Jews in Britain, which had taken place since 1876. In the summer of 1876, British political life had been galvanized by reports of atrocities committed against Bulgarian Christians by a Turkish Muslim militia. A vast swathe of liberal and public opinion was outraged and argued that Britain should abandon its ally Turkey and support the Christians struggling for independence. There were great public meetings, many articles in the press and pamphlets were full of the burning issue. Gladstone came out of retirement to lead the protest movement. The Conservative Party, however, was in power in these years, and Benjamin Disraeli was Prime Minister. Disraeli placed raison d'etat before sentiment. He was determined to support the Ottoman Empire. Worse still, he dismissed the atrocities as coffee house babble. Not only Disraeli, but most British Jews were reluctant to support the Bulgarians and favoured the Turks. They feared, not least from experience in Romania, that the replacement of Ottoman oversight with the rule of Christian nationalists would lead to a severe deterioration in the legal and material conditions of Jewish life. Led by Gladstone, the popular agitation looked for a reason to explain the indifference of Disraeli and of Jews generally to the suffering of Balkan Christians struggling for liberty. The leaders of the movement, men such as William Gladstone and the historians and essayists Edward Freeman and Goldwin Smith, found the answer in Friedrich Max Muller's ideas about Semites and Semitic religion and culture. Judaism, Goldwin Smith wrote, following Muller's argument, was an imperfect monotheism and a religion of race. The Jews' God was their deity alone, he asserted, and this accounted for their reluctance to support Bulgarian Christians. Gladstone, who was a frequent correspondent of Muller, more cryptically mourned the work of what he called Judaic sympathies in the politics of the Near East. And Edward Freeman wrote in typical forthright fashion, "We cannot sacrifice our people, the people of Aryan and Christian Europe, to the most genuine belief in Asian mystery. We cannot have England governed by Hebrew policy." Goldwin Smith drew out the implications. Jews had been granted equal rights with Christians on the basis of a false prospectus, he wrote. Jews were not merely a religious minority, they were a separate race. These were the political circumstances which immediately preceded the term anti-Semite reaching England as newspapers reported on the activities of the Anti-Semitic League in Germany. The Anti-Semitic League, led by Wilhelm Marr, asserted that Jewish emancipation in Germany had been a great mistake and that Germans required protection from Jewish influence and competition. British Jews quickly made the connection to the claims made by Freeman, Goldwin Smith, and by the liberal press. These, they said, were the English anti-Semites. So the term anti-Semite entered British Jewish political discourse, and there are three key features that I want to draw out about its meaning as it was in the first years of its use in Britain. First, far from being an ancient hatred, anti-Semitism was conceived as something newfangled and modern. It was a response to a pushback against Jewish emancipation. A leader article published in the Jewish Chronicle in 1881 placed the anti-Semitic movement in Germany alongside similar developments across Europe, which had arisen in the context of the equal citizenship to which Jews had been admitted progressively since 1848. In 1882, the full implications of this idea were set out in another article. It is only in Western Europe that Jews have civil equality, the paper wrote, and it is only among them that the Jewish question in its modern form could arise. 50 years ago, there would have been no thought of complaining that a Jew was not a good Englishman or Frenchman or German for the reason that he was tacitly regarded as not being an Englishman, a Frenchman, or a German at all. Second, as soon as the anti-Semitic movement was comprehended as something distinctively modern, it became possible to consider its causes in a new way too. In the same article that placed the trans-European anti-Semitic movement in the context of the Jews' recently acquired status as equal citizens, the Jewish Chronicle proposed that the Jews themselves were one prime cause of anti-Semitism, that in this regard, there were good Jews and bad Jews, and the bad Jews were largely composed of East European Jews. The Jewish Chronicle was not consistent in where it found fault. 2 weeks later, it was German Jews, not Polish Jews, who were to blame, due to their ostentatious bearing in all directions. This was not only a matter of their material vulgarity, but religious polemics that gratuitously offered defense and pamphlets that insisted too loudly on the Jews' achievements. The idea that Jews were a cause of anti-Semitism was introduced in tandem with the idea that anti-Semitism was a modern phenomenon. In the previous version, when anti-Semitism was simply dismissed as a form of bigotry, the idea of blaming Jews for it was not really there. It wasn't a starter, it wasn't on the agenda for those who wanted to support Jews. Third, Jews responded to anti-Semitism, in some cases, not in all cases, with an affirmation of their own Semitic and separate racial identity. We already heard one intimation of this when Sergeant Simon spoke about the Jewish race, but others went further. Jewish writers engaged with Muller and his followers. Yes, Jews are Semites, they said, but they place a different value and interpretation on this appellation. a leader article in the Jewish Chronicle in 1880 on the subject of Semitism makes the point. Surveying the previous century, the writer proposed that the great struggles between nations now stemmed from race, not from religion. And he traced this shift to the French Revolution, but that it had become prominent in the previous 20 years as a result of German and Italian unity and the development of the Pan-Slavic movement. This historic shift meant that it was of practical importance, he wrote, to examine what is exactly meant by the Semitism to which the anti-Semites object in the Jew. Far from questioning the concept, the writer asserted, one of the most remarkable facts in the history of humanity is the marvelous tendency with which racial characteristics maintain their identity through the course of ages. He traced many characteristics of the modern Jew back to the times when his ancestors roamed about the southwest of Asia, together with the progenitors of other Semitic tribes. He went on, Semites were not all alike, and there were some Jewish traits not common to all. The Jews were shaped by the Bible and the Talmud and their history, and the specific Jewish characteristics were family, love, intellectual patience, music and histrionic ability, capacity for finance, law-abidingness, intense historic feeling, and benevolence. So Jews too, or some of them, adopted the idea of the Semite and tried to make it work for them. In this way, Jews as well as non-Jews participated in the retreat from universalism and the advance of racial thinking in the last decades of the 19th century. This conception of anti-Semitism, this first iteration of anti-Semitism in Britain, is very different from the ideas we have today concerning what anti-Semitism is. The idea that Jews are responsible for anti-Semitism is now anathema. Anti-Semitism itself is most often conceived as something with deep roots, not a modern phenomenon, but something whose origins lie in the medieval or even the ancient world. And Jews today tend not to respond to anti-Semitism by claiming for themselves a positive identity as Semites. So my talk this evening will end with a question, which will have to be my subject on another occasion. By excavating the origins and first iteration of the term anti-Semitism, this provides a new window on the Anglo-Jewish past. But as I say, it also raises a question, namely why and when did the meaning of anti-Semitism change and transform into the contested concept we have today? Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, very, very much. David, am I right in thinking that the answer to that question will ultimately be the conclusion of your book or the product of the book that I know you're writing now?
Yes, yes.
Good.
That's correct, yes.
Good. Well, we have one question waiting already, but I think there's a question nagging at me, and I think maybe at others as well, and therefore I'll put it first and then pass it on to the other questioner, and that is, at what points in this conversation of the 19th century does what I might call traditional traditional Jew hatred or discomfort around Jews, which is associated with the Christian tradition, with the crucifixion, with the rituals of the church. I mean, I know that it's a Protestant country, but there are Catholics in it, but even within Protestantism, these texts are there and they are a challenge. So what was all that called? What is the vocabularies for, as it were, traditional discomfort around Jews at the time when these new terminologies are being developed?
I'm really glad you asked that, Miri, because in a longer presentation, I would have wanted to explain that the innovations that Muller and those around him bring stem from a position of liberal Christianity. The idea that there is some sharp break between traditional religious-based anti-Semitism and racial anti-Semitism doesn't work at all in this case. That Muller's roots are in German Lutheranism. His pals in Oxford were all liberal Anglicans. And what philology was meant, comparative philology was meant to do for them was to marry modern knowledge with Christian belief and faith.
Okay.
And so what he wanted to do was to vindicate, and this is to vindicate Christianity as a truly universal religion. And for that to happen, there had to be this fusion between the Semitic tribal God and the Aryan people.
Okay.
Had Jesus only remained among Semites, we wouldn't have had universal Christianity. So that's maybe not quite the answer you were looking for, but I think it's to say that this in its way is also Christian anti-Semitism.
Okay, thank you, David. So we have a question, John. I'm wondering whether I might just slightly rephrase your question. Would that be okay? Because you asked the question about universities, and John wrote the question quite early on in the lecture when you were talking about actually the Romanian atrocities, but I think you were prompted probably also by our contemporary history with so much activity around anti-Semitism from the left or whatever is also associated with universities. No, that wasn't it. So maybe you can rephrase it yourself, but it wasn't just about Romania, your question, right?
No, because I was thinking about other universities around Europe.
Mm.
All I know about is the case of JHSE in Romania.
Yes.
Of which I'm sure David knows much more about than I do.
Well, I think
university as the university, as it were, because you mentioned Müller, I'm just trying to formulate a question that everyone can benefit from. The university at that period, are universities a particular breeding ground of certain types of thinking?
Yeah.
Just like in some period in the past it was the monastery, or in some other period it was, you know, the Rotary Club or whatever. Is there something about the way the universities are situated in society that makes them that sort of fruitful field of development of these ideas?
Yes.
I mean, I think that is the case, although I think that what John's question refers to is really about Central and Southeastern European universities, not universities in Britain, but certainly in Central and Southeastern Europe, and I'm not the greatest expert on this. I mean, universities were breeding grounds for the sort of exclusionary nationalism, which easily bred anti-Semitism in the third quarter of the 19th century. I think there's also a way in which that question, in a sense, ties in with parts of my answer to Mira's question, which is to emphasize that, what we should see as the modernity of anti-Semitic ideas, rather than them being only the property of marginal people, only of peasants and artisans, people whom history is leaving behind. I don't think that was the case at all.
Thank you, David, and thank you, John. Colin, you had a question. Would you like to express it?
Firstly, can I just say how much I've really appreciated the talk, and I've always been puzzled by the non-Jewish reaction to the Damascus blood libel at the time, and I guess it just shows how hard it is to read history without wearing the spectacles of one's own time. So that was that. But my question is, how much is the progression that you've traced a reflection of, a manifestation of the shift throughout the 19th century from liberalism to romanticism and ending up in nationalism in the latter part of the 19th century. Because of course, you know, these things didn't exist just out of the great flow of ideas throughout the century. So I was wondering how.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. I mean, I'll answer that in two ways. First of all, if one thinks about Muller himself, but his English friends, these were definitely people who were influenced by German Romanticism and by the legacy of the ideas of Herder, the idea that a people's spirit was expressed in its language and hence in its literature and hence in its culture, and that this was determining. So it's no coincidence that Muller was a philologist, because it was philology that was seen to hold the key to this. Now, there was a very interesting Anglo-Jewish engagement with this in the period just after the one I'm talking about. And this was through Joseph Jacobs. Now, Joseph Jacobs was he was a polymath. He had a finger in many pies, but one pie he had a finger in for a while before he fell out with everyone was folklore. And of course, folklore was one of the great sites through the Grimms of German Romanticism. And Jacobs was completely out on a limb in his writing about folklore, because he wanted to say there were not such things as national traditions in folklore. He wanted to say that folk tales could be shared and cross borders, and didn't belong to one particular people. In a sense, it was sort of taking an argument. I think that what he wrote about folklore was an anti-romantic scholarship, in its way, an argument for the possibility of Jews acculturating and being integrated. So that's a roundabout way of strongly agreeing with what was implicit in your question, Colin. Thank you.
I have your teacher and friend, Gareth Stedman-Jones, here.
David, I really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Gareth.
And the question I'm going to ask really derives from my experience this afternoon as an MA examiner, reading Luther on the Jews. And the early Luther seems to have, I mean, Jews weren't a race, they were simply people who didn't understand or get or accept the truth. It was an intellectual or non-spiritual stance. Mm-hmm. And what I wondered really was how you can combine that sort of and it resulted in some pretty fierce anti-Judaism anyway. Yeah. But I wondered how you could change the question when you introduced the idea of Semitism into the argument, because in Luther's case, or in the early 16th century, it's really about, you know, just accepting the truth. And the reason why you might not accept the truth is because in the worst cases you're in league with the devil. So you're not going. It's not a racial thing. It's about a theological position. And what I wondered was, when you get this idea of a sort of racial determination, a linguistic determination, I should say, how could Jesus actually escape his Semitic origins and become universal? I didn't quite understand how that happened.
Oh, I see. Oh, wow.
There were two answers to it.
Just to say, Luther actually writes a pamphlet saying, an early one, which is more progressive, saying Jesus is born of a Jew. And
yes,
you know.
yeah. Well, Renan writes about this more than Muller, but so he has a slight. I think so. There's a so it's important that for Renan there was an environmental determinism as well as a linguistic determinism.
Yeah.
And so it's very important that Jesus came from the Galilee, which is green and lush.
Okay.
Really?
So he wasn't. So he hadn't been malformed by the desert in the same way that
Right.
the Jews had been. However, what both, in a way, it's a nice detail. But the more interesting point is something which is shared, is that the key word. So it is still Jesus is an anomaly, and the key break is made not by Jesus but by Paul, because Paul goes and evangelizes among non-Semitic peoples. So that's how it moves, and Christianity slowly comes into form.
Okay, thank you.
We have a question from John Thay, and then from Ira Katz-Nelson. John?
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Professor Feldman. It's always surprised me that the late Victorian and up to the 1930s, that the leadership of Anglo-Jewry was so anti-Zionist. But what you were saying about that that the establishment was thinking that Jews are not part of us, and I link that then to Montefiore's statement that he is a true Englishman of the Jewish persuasion. Do you think that that was a sort of riposte of Anglo-Jewry to this attitude that Jews are not really one of us?
I think that Jews responded in different ways. If you like, what you've described was one response from some Jews. If one went forward a couple of years, one would find articles by the young Claude Montefiore absolutely saying the sorts of things that you've just said. But there's that stream inside of Judaism which is not Zionist, but does quite explicitly want to take these ideas about race and Semites, whether they're formed in biological or philological ways, and emphasize, and actually do emphasize, the bonds between Jews. One finds that in the Anglo-Jewish Association. One finds it in writings in the early 1880s from the young Lucian Wolff. And some of this then goes into the early Hovevit Zion associations, which are not in favor of political Zionism, but they are in favor of colonization in Palestine. So although you're right to say this didn't lead to widespread support for Zionism among Jews in the late 19th century, I think that one upshot from it was actually found in movements which emphasized international solidarity between Jews in ways that earlier 19th century movements had not done so.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to Ira Katz-Nelson, and Paul, I want to keep your question to the last, if you don't mind.
David, thank you so much for this really interesting talk. The contrast you drew between pre and post, say, 1870 in two dimensions. One was the shift from universalism to a kind of particularism, and the other was a shift from a religious or non-racial basis of distinction to a more, call it broadly race-based sensibility. I find myself more persuaded by the second than the first, in the following sense, that the Damascus language and so on, which was universal in character, had a very particular kind of other. And the other, it allowed for the inclusion of Jews in the more civilized side of things. But at the very same moment, including in the very debates you cite about whether Jews should have to take a Christian oath in Parliament, there was for quite a time a very heavily articulated view that Jews should not, because they were different. This is a Christian country. Christianity is embedded in the Constitution, et cetera, which went hand in hand with the same people speaking universalist language when speaking about others who were at some distance from the mother country, from England or Britain, more broadly. So I wonder if you stack the deck in terms of the universalist language. And just a footnote, you mentioned the Jew Bill of 1753 in passing. After it was repealed in what manifestly, after a vigorous anti-Jewish movement, which you know very well, members got up in Parliament and said, but now we must repeal the Plantation Act of 1740, because that permitted Jews in the New World, as well as Quakers and Catholics and others we don't really want, to become naturalized Englishmen. They only had to settle in the New World if they were white for 7 years. And the response was, no, we can't repeal the Plantation Act because we have slavery in the New World and we need all the white people we can get. And I'm wondering if a kind of division, it's a different form of division, but between what goes on in Damascus or Romania allows for a stark divide between the enlightened, the civilized, and others whom John Stuart Mill called backward people in the same period that a kind of universal liberalism was being developed. So I wonder if the first period was more complex and dense with multiple linguistic moves, and it's just not exactly right to characterize it as the universalist moment, which gets lost later. That's my question.
Well, I mean, as ever, Ira, a fascinating and challenging question. Let me try to come at it. I'll say something which picks up on what you said at the end, and then try to get to the key point. I mean, I think there's an element in the paper in which I sort of tried to address the sorts of issues that you were getting at with the Plantation Act and so forth, when I tried to draw the distinction between the sorts of pressure that could be brought to bear upon non-Europeans and Europeans. So it's not a coincidence that they fail in Europe. What I didn't mention is that while they fail in Europe, they have a success in Morocco, because they're dealing with a state like the Ottoman Empire, whose sovereignty has already been compromised. So there is an element there which doesn't work in quite the way that you're talking about, but deals with some of the same broad questions. I'm sure, in fact, I know the narrative is more complex than I was able to convey today, but I'm not completely convinced that there were all those people, that there were so many people on the Jews' side over Damascus, who were but then against emancipation. One of the interesting, so I was talking about those as it were, who are on the Jews' side, but if one looks at the other side, one of the things which is remarkable is that the Times newspaper, a Tory newspaper, held the Damascus blood libel as an open question. It might be true, it might not be true, all the way through until Palmerston won and Muhammad Ali backed down. The person who might be grist to your mill is Peel, who did speak out over Damascus, only came round to removing Jewish disabilities by the end of the 1840s, and actually Peel is an unusual figure because he doesn't fit with my story at all, because he is the one person in Parliament whose speech is all about Jews and all about the terrible things which English people have done to the Jews through English medieval history. So for him, the Jews are at front and center. But he is an outlier. So, I mean, I take your question, I'll have to think about it. But if Peel is an outlier, he might in this case be the exception which proves my rule. And I'm not certain. I mean, I'll think about whether I've stacked the decks, but I'm not yet ready to say that I have.
David, you mentioned the Times, and that reminds me, of course, that by the time of the Baylis trial, yes, the Times is actually sending correspondence and spreading, you know, yes, it has a more robust, let's say, a more progressive, more universalist, perhaps, position on the issue of obviously a terrible injustice being committed yes, against a Jew.
Yes.
So something has happened in those later. I'd be really interested to know at some point more about what happens to that tradition. That is the lineaments of who carries on with that tradition, what you call the universalist one.
If I could just.
Yes.
Well, I was just going to say that that's important. It's an important case, and it shows that the universalist tradition. I mean, it doesn't just disappear. It's alive and well then in the response to the Baylis case.
Yeah, the Baylis case, just for those who may not know, it was an infamous accusation of ritual murder in a very sort of medieval style against a Jew, which was then tried in Kiev. But ultimately, it became a cause célèbre. It really became one of the first cases that were truly, truly worldwide known and written on and commented on and so on. Okay. And ultimately, in 1908, he was released. So Paul, you have waited long because I just thought you might put your question as our last question this evening. We try not to go for more than an hour. It's evening, and also it's on the screen. But you've given us so much to think of. But Paul, you had a question earlier on. Would you like to put it now? Paul Vallely.
Yes, it was that when I was researching my history of philanthropy, I sent the chapters, the medieval chapters, to Professor Brian Pullen, who ticked me off for referring to medieval anti-Semitism, and he pointed out that, you know, in 1290 in England and in Italy during the early modern period, and when the Monti de Pieta were being introduced, that all of the opposition and hostility to Jews was based in the notion of wrong belief rather than inferior race, as it were. And so the suggestion was that anti-Judaism is a better term to use before 1870 than any kind of anti-Semitism. Does that have any resonance with you?
I think it has resonance, and I think it carries an important truth, an important reminder for us. But I think that, and often this discussion of these issues does hinge on a divide that people make between religious anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism and racial anti-Semitism. But there's a missing term here, and that term is a modern sociological term, which is racialization, which is the sort of basically turning individuals into a type. And the effect of anti-Judaism, it was not just a religious critique of the Jews. It was that the Jews have these wrong beliefs, and this makes them into this sort of a person. So it had consequences beyond the religious. It had racializing consequences, as a sociologist would say. So I agree with what Brian Pullen said to you, but I'd say it's not the end of the discussion, because there's more going on between Christians and Jews in that period than only a religious disagreement.
And indeed, of course,
would you make then between the treatment of heretics and the treatment of Jews in that medieval period?
At that point, I would defer to Professor Rubin.
Category of...
I think that's definitely for another time, but that's a very interesting point, because there is a very famous scholar called R.I. Moore who wrote a book called The Formation of a Persecuting Society, in which he sees that the impulse to prosecute Jews, to seek out Jews, to limit their activities, to seek out heretics are in a way different faces of the same sort of the institutions of the church as they become solidified in the 12th and into the 13th centuries. So maybe that will be for another time. And just to add to what David said about the racialized potential of attitudes to Jews in earlier centuries, of course, even after the Jews converted to Christianity and, as it were, saw the light in the 15th and 16th century, particularly in the 15th century in Spain, late 14th, 15th in Spain, nonetheless, there was a notion, increasing notion, that a new Christian, a Christian who is in origin a Jew, is really a different thing. And that is because of the impurity of their blood. And that is, of course, a racial trope, if there ever was one. But I, in my practice, tend to use the word anti-Judaism when I talk about my earlier centuries. Yeah. But David, of course, is right that it's not just a clear binary distinction between religion and racial attributes, of course not. But then we're such a sophisticated group here of history lovers. I'm sure everybody understands how these issues are never simple, but it's so interesting and wonderful to probe them with such expertise and patience, and also subtle humor, if I may say, even in these grim subjects. You always manage to, David. So for that, we're all very, very grateful. And just to remind you also that I hope you will join us at the next session, which of course I'll write to you about again, but it was already advertised in the last communication on the 15th of October after the holidays. And it will be really very, very interesting. It's a person called Sally Dixon Smith, who's a medievalist, but she also works for historic royal palaces. And she's one of the people who's in charge of the Tower, as it were, the Tower of London. And she conducted research on all the royal documents of the history of the Tower on the relationship of the Jews to the Tower of London, a place where they went to hide sometimes when there were riots outside, but also a place where they were arrested and kept as if in prison. And extremely, extremely interesting material I won't divulge, but she has kindly agreed to be our next speaker for October, which will be 15th October, but I'll let you know all about that. But David, yet again, thank you so much. This was a real treat, and we have a recording, so if you know any friends who would like to listen to it or couldn't join us this evening, please send them to the website within a day or two. The recording will be up there as well, or indeed, if you want to savor it again. So good night, keep safe, everyone. Tell your friends about the society, encourage them to join the society. We really